Well, welcome to the Orchard podcast. We are in the final episode of our fourth series, looking at more women of the story. We have been looking at just different women in the scriptures and seeing how they are catalysts for the story of God, for the extension of the kingdom. And it's been wonderful, hasn't it, Rach? Again,
yeah, I loved it.
Eye-opening. But for the final episode, we are particularly excited again to welcome back Paula.
Yes, if you've been following this series, you'll know that Paula joined us. I should say, Dr. Paula Gooder. Yeah. She joined us couple of episodes ago, and we looked at this Phoebe, who features in the Book of Romans, and it was amazing. We got so much great feedback. People loved it, and so we've got Paula back, who she very kindly said yes. Hello, we should allow you to say hello.
Hello, it's great to be back with you.
And we're going to be looking at Lydia, who features in Acts 16. And just to say, in case you didn't hear Phoebe, first of all, go back and listen to that episode. Second of all, Paula has written these two brilliant books. We're going to talk about a little bit more later. Phoebe and Lydia, and it just really creatively, theologically unpacks their stories and their significance in the New Testament. And so, just by way of introduction, Paula is a brilliant New Testament theologian, specifically a Pauline theologian, so studying Paul's letters, etc. So amazing insights. Again, I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment. I know you lecture at numerous theological colleges and written not just these books, Phoebe and Lydia, but many other brilliant books. You're also Canon Chancellor at St. Paul's Cathedral. And so it is an honour, it's a real honour that you would join us again. And so I guess jumping straight in, and we covered this a little bit in the Phoebe episode. Often women, Christian women, have an interesting relationship with Paul. And the reason for that is that there are certain verses that appear in his letters in the New Testament that appear to say certain things about the role of women, particularly in the church. And for good reason. If you take those verses at face value without really grappling with them and understanding the context and looking at the whole of what Paul has to say about women, it would be easy to understand why. And yet you, as a theologian, have chosen specifically to study Paul, and you love him. I know you love what he has to say, and I'm fascinated by your explanation for why you believe Paul is pro women and actually encouraged women in leadership and speaking and teaching. So what would you say to that?
Well, let me start by telling you why I love Paul first, and then we'll go on to the women. You see, I need to confess that when I was an undergraduate, I was in Oxford, and I was at a place called Worcester College, and my tutor was Tom Wright. So the first reason I love Paul is you cannot sit in a room with Tom Wright and not catch his infectious enthusiasm for reading Paul. So, imagine me as a young 19-year-old just kind of listening to Tom Wright and going, oh, wow, this is so exciting. Yeah. And then when I got into reading Paul for myself, the thing that I think is just amazing about Paul is that the Gospels are telling us the story about Jesus, what Jesus did, who Jesus met, his ministry, his teaching, his death and resurrection. But Paul is the first person in the early church who said, yeah, but what does that mean? What difference does that make to us? And what Paul is really trying to do in his letters, in talking to the various different congregations that he's either founded or he's writing into, not knowing them, he's saying, this is who Jesus is. And this is why it makes all the difference in the world to who we are as people, to the communities we live in, to actually how the world is. And when you realize that Paul was the very first person really who was grappling with that, then you can't but realize what an important person he was, because he was kind of giving us that whole so what question. yes, Jesus lived in Galilee. Yes, he died and rose again. And Paul does that. And this is therefore what it means. So that's why I love reading.
Yeah, I love that.
And then the more I get into reading Paul, and one of the things I began to notice, so this was a long way in, having really enjoyed reading Paul's letters, I then began to go, you know what everyone tells you about Paul's attitude to women, and you've referred to it already, those key verses that everyone refers to as saying, Paul does not support women's ministry. I kept on reading these references to women. Who were like, for example, well, there's Phoebe, who we talked about last time, who brought the letter to Rome. You've got people like Nympha, who has a church meeting in her house. You've got Euodia and Syntyche, who we'll talk about later in Philippians, who were clearly in ministry with Paul. You've got Priscilla with her husband Aquila, who corrected someone whose theology was wrong. With all of them, Paul seems to go, well, he doesn't say anything. If you imagine Paul to be the kind of person that people normally tell you Paul is, he'd have been going, and will you stop? You shouldn't have a church in your house, and you shouldn't be correcting people, and you shouldn't be taking the letter to the Romans. But Paul never does. And it's as though he goes, well, that's what a woman would do. Of course you would. And then you have to say, well, if Paul doesn't have a problem with it, then why have we got a problem with it? And if Paul doesn't have a problem with it, perhaps in those verses that we talk about so often, maybe he wasn't saying that. Maybe he was saying something else. So that's where I kind of enter into it. And as you know, I have so many other things to say about those other verses, but it's not what we're here to talk about. But that's just kind of to talk you into how I got to the stage of going, I just don't think Paul says that.
Yeah.
So good. It's so good. And I sort of feel like we could press stop right there. Yeah. It is so good. It's so, it's so encouraging to hear again, so articulately said. But yes, we're talking about Lydia today. And like we said on the Phoebe podcast, and we're trying to do it with all of our the podcasts, trying to sort of talk about it through a bit of a structure. And so the three questions that we'd love to ask you today are, firstly, what do we know about Lydia? So what do we learn about her? The second question is, what do we then learn about God? What does this say about God's view of women, of kingdom purpose, all of that stuff? And then really, what do we take away? What can we, how do we move forward in our own lives in light of this? So that's kind of where we're heading loosely. For those that take notes that are listening, you might want to structure it around that. But we're going to start by reading it, and then we're going to jump into the first question.
Yeah, so we're going to...
Who's the best reader, aren't you?
No, not necessarily. I'm just brave enough to take on some of the place names and get them wrong. I feel quite intimidated reading them in front of Paula. Normally, I just say them confidently enough that people just believe that is how they're said. Anyway, yeah. So we're in Acts 16, looking at verses 11 to 15. So from Troas, we put out to sea and sailed straight to Samothrace. Samothrace. I added a little, emphasis at the end there. And the next day we went to Neapolis. From there, we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony and the leading city of that district of Macedonia. And we stayed there several days. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshipper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. So there she is. So would you just, would you give us a little bit of context for what's going on here? Why is it significant?
So the first thing to note is that this is a really, really important point in Paul's ministry. because until this moment, he has ministered in what we would call the East. So he's been in Jerusalem, he went up to Antioch and to Damascus, and then he would go, I'm going to do my little around the map. What we now call Turkey, which they called Asia Minor, he kind of went, and we trace his different journeys. But basically what he seems to have done is he went up and he went round, and then he went back, and then he went up and he went round, and then he carried on up to the place called Troas, which we these days more are commonly known as Troy. So think Trojan horses and all those kind of things. That's the ancient city that he was in. And when he was in Troas, he had a vision of a man from Macedonia.
Yeah.
The Lord closed the doors for him. He wasn't able to proclaim the gospel. The man from Macedonia appeared to him in a dream and said, come over here and help us. So that's when Paul got in the ship from Troas. And if you trace it on the map, the way you get there is you go via Samothrace, which is an island, and then you hop onto the mainland, Neapolis, and then you go a little bit north, and then you get to Philippi. So the really important thing about this is the first time Paul goes to what we would now call the West. Before it's the East, just Asia Minor, and so Syria, what we now called the Holy Land, Syria and Asia, and Turkey. He's been there so far. Then he goes over into Macedonia, which is Greece, and he's not been in the West thus far. So the first bit of context, which is really important, is that what we have is the account of the first ever Western Christian converting to Jesus in the West, who is coincidentally a woman. So one of the things I really love about this story is you've got this story of the first ever Western Christian. So therefore Lydia isn't just any old person who converts to Jesus, but the first person from the West who converts to Jesus, which is kind of, I think, is just worth pausing on in and of itself.
Yeah.
Yes,
and what would Lydia's worldview have been like at that point? So what's she almost having to she has a set of, what would her set of beliefs be at that point for her then to have come to this place of believing in Jesus?
Well, that's why we get on to the bit about the place of prayer that you noted what you read out from Acts 16, and that causes us to be all kinds of interested. Because the thing we know about Paul from Acts is that whenever he goes to a new place, he goes to a synagogue. And the first thing he does is he goes into the synagogue and he preaches there, and then he goes on and does other things. So clearly when he got to Philippi, he went looking for a synagogue. But what's interesting in Philippi is he doesn't go to a synagogue, he goes to a place of prayer. And what most scholars think about that is that, well, not most scholars, a number of scholars think, I'm going to retract myself a little bit. What some scholars think about that, and I am one of them, is that in order to be able to have a synagogue, we know from Jewish literature, you need to have 10 men. So this was probably a Jewish place of prayer because of the language that was used, but there were probably not 10 men. And we don't know how many men there were, but not as many as 10 that would then make it into a full synagogue. So he went to a place of prayer, which was probably a Jewish place of prayer. And the first most significant person he talks to is Lydia. So one of the things I wonder about is actually whether it was an entirely female group. It may not have been, there may have been a few men there, but the guess is that there weren't as many as 10, which would then have made it a synagogue and therefore a formal place of Jewish worship. So that tells us just a little bit, then I'll stop for you to jump in. What that means, therefore, is that Lydia has some kind of Jewish framework into which then Paul spoke about Jesus.
Well, can you rolling on then? Can you give us more about Lydia? What do we learn about her? There's obviously things that you can pick up here, but yeah, give us it all, Paula. what do we learn about her? What do we know about her?
She's amazing, isn't she? I mean, that's the thing that I think is absolutely fabulous about her. And Luke in Acts just says, like, it's no big deal. She was a dealer in purple. Now, one of the things that's really important is that purple was one of the most valuable commodities in the Roman world. And various people try and work out kind of comparatively, but it was thought to be more valuable than gold.
Wow.
So kind of one of those really, really valuable things. And purple was the sign of your wealth and influence in the Roman world. So it was what was worn by kings. It was what was worn by people who were in the Senate, the Roman Senate. And therefore, because people like to wear things to show themselves to be important, if you wanted to demonstrate you were important, then you would wear purple. The reason why it was so expensive is because some forms of purple were made from what is known as a murex shellfish, and a murex shellfish was found on the banks of the Mediterranean. And I forget the exact numbers, but you need vast quantities of these shellfish that you have to boil and then crush up. That would then gives you the purple dye.
Wow.
And that's known as Tyrian purple. And Tyrian purple is the dye that was often used to dye king's robes and those kinds of things. However, there's a really interesting little wrinkle here, which is that Lydia, as you read out, comes from Thyatira. And Thyatira is a place in Asia Minor, so she was from Turkey originally. And first little interesting thing is that the area in which Thyatira sits in Asia Minor was known as Lydia.
Wow.
So one of the things that I played with when I was writing the story was whether Lydia was her nickname or not, or whether it was her actual name, or whether it was, you know, Thingy from Lydia, who then became called Lydia. And I just love the idea that she was called the place where she came from. Who knows? But what Lydia was known for, Lydia the place rather than Lydia the person, is they were known for producing purple. They produced a different kind of purple. They produced something that was made from madder root. So there's a root of a plant called madder, and that produces a different kind of red, purple. And it's known these days as Turkish red. So if you imagine purple from a kind of a pinky end, which is the purple bit, all the way through to the red end, think of a purple that's more red, and that was the kind of purple that they produced. And one of the things, therefore, that's really interesting is Lydia, who comes from Lydia, is an area that's known for producing a different kind of purple, not murex purple, but madder purple. So not Tyrian purple, but Turkey red, and that she was a dealer in that kind of purple. So it just kind of, once you can start ferreting away into that, you go, wow, that's just so interesting. So probably what happened was that she lived in this place called Lydia, and everyone went, yeah, anyone can get madder root round here. So she probably then took her purple business somewhere else where there wasn't madder root growing, so then she could then trade. The other thing to know about Philippi is that Philippi is on the major trade route. If you start in Rome and want to go east, then what you have to do is you land in what is now I forget which exact country it is. I think it might be Albania now. You take the Via Egnatia, and you take the Via Egnatia all the way through northern Greece and then onwards into the east. So Philippi is a great place to sell your purple because you catch traders who are going east or west.
Good footfall is what they say.
So Lydia is clearly both skilled at what she produces, but then also a very canny businesswoman. Where do you want to go to sell your purple? Well, you want to go where the best footfall is going to be, and on the trade route is going to be one of those. So you begin to get this sense of a very interesting woman. She's an entrepreneur. She clearly owns her own business, because that is how it's referred to. The word that's used when she says to Paul, come and stay in my house, the word that's used is an actual house. And that's the other thing that's quite interesting, is if you were poor and you lived in the Roman Empire, you would probably live in a tenement building, which is kind of like an apartment block. And the idea was that people who lived on the bottom would have a lovely house, and then it got worse and worse as you went up. But she doesn't live in a tenement building. She lives in a house, which was probably a Roman villa. And that begins to give you the idea that if she's got enough space for to go, hey, come stay, then she's got a big house. So therefore, she was probably quite wealthy. So dealer in purple, canny trader, quite wealthy, living in a big house, and you're beginning to get a little bit of a sense of who she was.
And when it refers to her household, what does that mean? You know, who is her household? Is she married? Would she have children? Who is that?
Well, she probably isn't married, because normally the customs would have been that you would have referred to the household by the name of the husband. So if it's her household, it probably means that she's widowed, which is the more likely option, than that she'd never been married, because everyone in the Roman Empire was married, with a couple of exceptions, but mostly they were married. So therefore she was probably widowed, and therefore owns her own wealth. And her household will have included everyone who lives in her house, at which point you then have to recognize this is a Roman house and not a British house. So everyone who lives in my house is me, my husband, and my eldest daughter, my youngest daughter being at university. That's who lives in my house. Whereas in the Roman world, it would have been, and all your slaves and the people who worked for you in other capacities. So her household is kind of a big family, not just a small number of people.
Okay, so we've got a picture of who she is. Go on, Azy.
Just before we move on, because I know that we're coming to talk about what do we learn about God and stuff, but interesting, because I've started to read your book, so I highly recommend picking up Lydia to read. But it talks about the relationship with this slave girl we read at the beginning that could see the future. There's a bit of you talk about in the book a relationship could you unpack that? What's going on there? What does that mean? What does that say about Lydia? Yeah, help me understand that a little bit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. So basically, I connected Lydia with this slave girl because it happened in Philippi. Acts 16 doesn't say there's a connection, but I bet there was. But it doesn't say that there was. So Paul arrives in Philippi, and there is this slave girl who is prophesying. And the language that's used of her is not just that she is possessed by demons, as such as you might find in the Gospels, but the phrase that's used of her suggests that she is a Delphic oracle. So a Delphic oracle was very important in the Greek Empire before the Roman Empire, but continued onwards into the Roman Empire. There's a place called Delphi, sorry, my brain went completely blank there for a moment. Delphi. There's a place called Delphi. And if you were Greek and you wanted to consult the gods, if you wanted to have somebody, it's a little bit like horoscopes or tarot cards, that kind of thing. You wanted somebody to declare what was going to happen to you in the future. You would go to Delphi, and there would be an oracle. And the female, and she was always a female prophet, and the female prophet would be taken over by the god Apollos, and then the god would declare a message to the person who was asking. And the language that's used of this slave girl is that she, although obviously not in Delphi, she was in North Greece, but she was proclaiming oracles like the oracle in Delphi used to. And what is fascinating is it refers to her as having more than one master. The plural is used for masters. So therefore, slightly unusually in the Roman world, a slave was owned by more than one person, two men. And if she was owned by two men, the implication is that they were making money off her, because that's the only reason why you would have more than one master. So the idea for me is that what you've got is a slave girl who can in some way get in touch with the spirit world, and we can leave aside precisely what that means.
Yes,
but
leave that for another episode.
Yeah, we'll not worry ourselves for that for now. But in the way that worked in the Greek Empire, she was recognized as someone who could tell fortunes.
Yeah.
And therefore, her masters were making money off her telling fortunes. She then encountered Paul and declared a prophetic oracle about Paul. And Paul, however, I mean, it depends how you want to use the language. Paul cast the demon out of her. He prevented her from being able to do it anymore. And her masters were furious. So for me, the really interesting thing about that whole engagement is that you've got somebody who is prophesying by kind of calling on other techniques.
Yeah.
Paul encounters her, casts that ability out. And the reason why in my novel I connect her with Lydia is I can't imagine a Christian community. This slave girl then stops being able to make any money. She's cast out by her masters. A Christian community is surely not going to go, oh, well, never mind, poor you. They're surely going to take her in.
Yeah.
And then I imagined who was taking her in, and I went, oh, I don't know, Lydia. Let's call her Lydia. So then that's why I connected the two together.
Ah, okay.
And we do, and Lydia kind of bookends Act 16 anyway, doesn't she? So we know Paul then goes back to her house, so we know she's there. She's there for all of this as well.
Yeah.
Actually, I just wanted to ask about your books, Phoebe, obviously specifically Phoebe and Lydia, because the way you've written them it's different from the way you've written other books. You know, as a theologian, it would be much there wouldn't be as much room for imagination, let's put it that way. And I think it's fascinating. In fact, really the premise for Amy and I doing this podcast in the way that we have is because we have sensed God really wanting to remind women of their significance, their significant role. Amy uses the word catalyst a lot, the catalyst that these women play in the story of God. And that applies to us today. Again, don't want to jump ahead to the last section, but obviously when we look at the scriptures, if you sort of compare verse by verse, book by book, chapter by chapter, the number of verses dedicated to women, the women who feature in the story, is just so much smaller. And so therefore, approaching the books as you have allowed your imagination to sort of fill in the gaps. I think it's amazing because again, as a woman, we're given, I know this is a word you use, Paula, like these threads, and you've done the work, you've done the study, you've done the research, but there is still room for imagination to sort of build a story around them without departing from the essence. It's a bit like the TV series Chosen, that which I have got so much out of. It doesn't feel like we're having to compromise our beliefs, but if anything, it brings it alive. And I think it's so important that we've done that for the women. And so I guess my question is, how has that been received? Like, because there'll be some that find that hard. What's that been like?
It's been received as you would imagine, basically. So there are a lot of people who really love it, and a lot of people who really hate it. And gender-wise, more women love it and more men hate it. I mean, it's kind of not an entire. I've had lots of conversations with men who've enjoyed it as well. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but kind of roughly speaking, it is like that. And a whole load of people have said to me, how do you respond to the accusation that you're just making it up?
Yeah.
And my response is, well, actually, if it drives you back to the text, to read the text really carefully and work out what I can know and what I've made up, then I'm all good. Because actually, my sole vocation in life, and it really is my sole vocation, is to get people to read the Bible again and again and again, because the Bible is fabulous. So if my writing an imaginative story gets you to go back and work out what we can and can't know from the Bible, then happy days as far as I'm concerned, because that's what I think we should be doing. And
it's so does it's so I was like, oh, I want to find out where.
Yes.
You know, where is that?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
There you go. You've done it.
And even, I think I said to you earlier, Paula, essentially Lydia leads us to Philippians, the book of Philippians, because it's set in Philippi. And obviously Paul is writing to the church in Philippi. And so essentially Lydia is like a theological dive into the book of Philippians for those that perhaps wouldn't pick a theological book, a sort of something that's a bit straighter, if you like, off the shelf. And again, for women listening, I would encourage you, read Phoebe, read Lydia, because as Paula said, I know it will direct us back to the scripture. It will bring it alive in a different way. So I think that's wonderful. Anyway, that was a slight detour and a shameless plug for your brilliant two books.
Quick question, just before we move on, Rachel.
Yeah.
Why is Lydia then not mentioned in Philippians? Can you give us a snippet?
So one of the great things about writing stories is it gives you the opportunity to go, yeah, but why? Which is my eternal question about life generally. But why? And one of the things that is often not noticed is that Lydia is so important in Acts 16, not mentioned at all in Philippians. And therefore that suggests that she is not in Philippi when Paul is writing Philippians, or at least Paul thinks she's not in Philippi when he's writing Philippians. So therefore he doesn't address it to her. And that raises a whole range of questions about where did she go? Why is she not there anymore? And there's a whole range of answers you could give. Probably the most likely answer is that she was a trader, and therefore traders moved around. And when the footfall through Philippi wasn't so great, she went off somewhere else to sell her purple. But what I imagined in the book was that there was a particular reason why she left. And I kind of shall I reveal?
Oh, spoiler alert.
Shall I?
I think leave it.
Spoiler alert. Because the thing that really interests me is that when Paul casts the spirit out of the slave girl and she no longer works for the masters anymore, you notice that actually there's a whole load of rioting going on, which is incidentally what lands Paul and Silas in jail. From which they have the miraculous escape. And then they're told, will they leave Philippi quickly because they're causing all sorts of unrest. I imagine that poor slave girl is going to be the focus of quite a lot of the unrest. So what my thought was that what Lydia did was took the slave girl out of Philippi so that she wouldn't be in danger. And but then I imagine in the book that she comes back, because otherwise it's not so much fun. So at the start of the book, she's coming back to Philippi for the first time and then meeting all the people who we know about living in Philippi from Philippians rather than from Acts.
So good.
Yeah, makes sense. So what does this then, I guess the next question, what does this tell us about who God is, the nature of God, and again, the way as women, we know, scripture tells us we are made in the image of God. We know, that our call to play our parts in the kingdom of God is as significant as men. And so what specifically can we draw out about who God is and who God says we are in light of Lydia and the story?
Well, do you know, I think the thing I love about the fact that Lydia is the first Western Christian is that were Christian tradition to be making the choice about who the first Western Christian would be, it wouldn't have been a woman, would it? They would have gone, well, somebody important and somebody maybe a Roman citizen or somebody really influential. And I think for me, what I really love about this story is, although Lydia has no idea at the time that she is that significant because she's the first Western Christian. Actually, what she did was she listened to God speaking to her through Paul and went, I believe. Baptize me now, quick. And one of the things I think is really fabulous is that she had a genuine, heartfelt response to God and God's work in her life. And it turned out she was really important. I dare say she had no idea she was really important when she responded. She just responded to God. And for me, there's something really important about that. As women, we're often told that we need to kind of mind our place and not kind of consider ourselves to be too greatly important and all those kind of things. And I don't think God's read the same guidebook. God says, I'm going to choose the people I choose. They might be a man, they might be a woman. I'm going to choose the people who are key for my plan. And I think there's something really fabulous for us in that recognition that you might go, well, no, I couldn't possibly do that because, you know, it needs to be done by an important person, whoever we deem an important person to be. Whereas God goes, no, it's you.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. And actually there are those themes, aren't there, running through again, so the sort of the honor shame culture that is in existence very much so at that time. And even that the very heart of Paul's letter to the Philippians is around humbling ourselves, you know, using Jesus as the example in Philippians 2. And is there anything more that we can learn around that?
Oh, there's so much. I mean, the honor shame bit is really interesting. So one of the really key elements in Roman society, and in fact, actually in all ancient Near Eastern society, as well as Roman society, was this whole notion of honor and shame. And basically, it worked on the principle that your goal in life was to accrue as much honor as you possibly could. And you did that by casting as much shame as you could on somebody else. So you would gather all the honor to yourself, and you would make sure that somebody else got the shame. So that meant that you would sit in the most important seats at dinner, and you would know your place because you would know yourself to be really important. And if anything happened that might potentially bring shame on you, you would push it quickly onto someone else to make sure that was kind of appropriately apportioned. So they function really, really strongly with this whole idea of honor and shame. And then you read Philippians 2, the very, very beautiful Christ hymn, who said, do you know what? Christ didn't do that. And that kind of opening bit, which I just think is such spectacular theology. You know, Jesus, who didn't consider equality with God a thing to be. And then there's a really interesting question about that word.
Okay. Not grasped? Is it not?
No, not necessarily grasped. Okay. The word that's used is the word that you would use for kind of clutching something to your chest. So hung on to, clung on to, because the word grasped implies that you haven't got it and you're reaching for it. Whereas the word actually means it's the thing that you've got already. I was a very, very long time ago when my children were way smaller than they are now. They're now adults. I was trying to wrestle with that exact verb, and I was going, I can't work out how to put it into English. And my youngest daughter had some friends coming around on a play date. And as she did at that time, she was about 5, she gathered up all her favorite toys. Like this, going, these mice, to make sure she wasn't going to share them with anybody else. And I went, that is the word. Jesus did not consider equality with God a thing to be held on to himself, like the favorite toys. He had it already. The point was that he wasn't grasping for equality with God. It was his by right. But the whole thing is that he had held it in an open hand and not kind of clutched it to himself. And that is what Paul is talking about. Honor isn't a thing that you clutch to yourself. You let it go. You don't consider it a thing that you just have to hang on to at all costs. And then that's how the Christian life kind of unfolds for us. So we may discover subsequently that something we've done is very important. We may discover that people think we are honored and honorable, but actually that's not our goal. Our goal is to let it all go, because actually it is humbling ourselves, which is the key thing, and kind of completely countercultural.
Yeah. Wow.
And I always think, I know I'm just conscious of the time, but I'm always aware of that in the context of women being empowered to step up. And it's interesting, isn't it, when you hold that the theology of Philippians 2 against, say, the feminist movement. And so much of it is good and right, this sort of setting right or wrong. And yet within it, though, is a power dynamic that is so alien to Philippians 2, so the reverse of.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that Amy and I have really tried to grapple with, tried to teach into with the Orchard, is around what does it look like for us to stand up against injustice, to play our part, not to shrink back, but to grapple with the scriptures and really understand who God has made us to be, what he's made us for, at the same time to operate within the same power dynamic that Jesus does, the laying down of our lives, the not grasping honor or esteem for ourselves, not grasping, sorry, holding on to. It's, I don't know, I know we're running out of time. How have you navigated that as a clearly intelligent, competent woman in what has historically been a man's world? How have you run your race with all the gifts that God has given you, and not try to grab hold of power? Does that make sense?
It's one of the most complicated things in the world. We probably need another hour.
Okay, sorry. Yes, you're right.
Because and it's one of the things I reflect on in the book Lydia, because I have the slaves having a conversation about the Christ hymn, because it's something that it's easier if you've got all the power and all the kudos and all the honor, then actually it's clear what you're meant to do. But what if you've got none? What if you're a slave who hasn't got any? How then do you relate to giving up what you have never had? And it's one of those things that I really wrestle with in my current job, because my current job is one which looks on the outside as having lots of status, but actually a layperson has never done it before. I'm the first person in the country to do my kind of job as a layperson. A woman hasn't done my particular job before, Canon Chancellor, and there's a whole load of people who think I shouldn't do it. And therefore you have this kind of really very, to talk, how you work out the power dynamics becomes really important, because by my theology, I want to lay all the power down. But then if people think you shouldn't have it in the first place and take it off you, then what do you do? Do you just go, yes, of course, please have all the power? Or do you then have to wrestle for it? But if you're wrestling for it, then you're not being Philippians 2. So
exactly.
Question that shows you the inside of my head most days, going, well, do I just let it go? Do I pick it back up again? And I think it's a really complicated thing.
I've landed.
Probably should have another hour. I did.
Yeah, we probably should.
I think the thing that just really is ringing in my ear from what you've said, the thing that I'm going to take away and maybe helps me answer your questions just now, is that she just responded. Like she responded to Jesus, the gospel, the truth, and she just did what was in her. She opened her home. She said, "Come," and actually, it was the Lord's job to raise her up. And I think I love that actually our part is we respond and he does the rest, not shying away or pushing forward, but do you know what I mean? I love that. Just responded. That's what I'll be taking away. Just respond to the call of the Lord and let him figure out.
Let him work out all the complicated stuff.
That sounds like a brilliant place to end, actually, doesn't it? We have well and truly run out of time. My goodness, we could keep going. But just again, a massive, massive thank you, not just for this, Paula, but also for all the brilliant work that you've done. It's such a gift to the church, and personally for Amy and I, we're really, really grateful. Really grateful. Thank you for saying yes to the call.
Well,
thank you for responding.
A very lovely chat. I could just chat to you for hours.
Well, thank you for listening, if you were listening to this. And that brings us to the end of our series. We're going to be doing a new series in the new year, and we're looking forward to that. So details of that will follow. But have a great Christmas and see you in 2025. Bye.